Good evening, everyone. Welcome to White Collar Week. This is our Tuesday night speaker series that we have once a month, where we have guests in the white collar ecosystem. Tonight is no different. Our guest is Miriam Baer, who's the Vice Dean at Brooklyn Law School, and she wrote a book called Myths and Misunderstandings in White Collar Crime. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a second. I have a few announcements. First is I'm Jeff Grant, the host tonight. And on Monday nights, we hold a white collar support group that has been going on for 7.5 years. So next Monday night is our 391st meeting. Very excited about 400 meetings coming up soon. If you'd like to join us, you can find information and sign up at our website. That's prisonist.org. That's prisonist, like feminist.org. And you'll got we have all kinds of resources there that'll be helpful to you about our group and all the different services we provide. But the core of it is our white collar support group that meets on Monday nights. So let's see. Next month on January 16th, we have our guest speaker is going to be Aaliyah Michelle Johnson, and she is a wellness expert. And what we're going to be doing next month is something a little bit different. So I'm gonna read that real fast. This is about next month. And then I'll get to Miriam Baer tonight. So regarding next month on January 16th, at times in our journeys when many of us have limited control over many of our external situations, there are still things we can control, namely our attitudes, our bodies, and our ability to help others. Aaliyah will guide us through a wellness session of mind, body, spirit, integration, serenity, and acceptance. She will also provide us some simple takeaways as we can use every day to ensure our health, happiness, and stamina for the trials ahead. So tune in for that. January 16th. You can find a link to it on our website, prisonist.org, or in the emails that we send out pretty regularly. So tonight, our special guest is Miriam Baer. She is the Vice Dean and a Centennial Professor of Law at Brooklyn Law School. During the 2021-2022 academic year, she was a visiting fellow at Harvard University at Minsafra Center for Ethics, where she worked on her book, Myths and Misunderstandings in White Collar Crime, published by Cambridge University Press. A little bit about the book, Myths and Misunderstandings in White Collar Crime, uses real-world examples to explore the pathologies that hamper our ability to understand and redress white-collar crime. The book argues that several misinterpretations about white-collar crime continue to impede its enforcement, including its failure to be classified according to degrees of severity in many jurisdictions, its failure to statutorily parse groups of defendants into major and minor players, and the failure of statutes to effectively define crimes, leading to the prosecution of unwritten crimes. Miriam Baer offers a step-by-step framework informed by theories of institutional design and behavioral psychology for redressing these misunderstandings through code design or paying greater attention to how we write, frame, and lay out our federal criminal code as a roadmap to more coherent and useful laws. A clear, subdivided criminal code paves the way for a discussion of white-collar crime unmarred by myths and misunderstandings. That's a brilliant write-up, I have to tell you. So I want to introduce Miriam. Welcome to White Collar Week, and we're going to give you the floor. And thank you for being our guest.
Oh, well, thank you. It's a privilege to be here. Now, if you give me just 1 second, I'm going to get this up here. And then, okay, I think this is up. And I'm just gonna, okay, are we good? And I'm gonna go right here. All right, can everybody see? I assume you guys can all see this?
Yep, we're good.
Okay, wonderful. All right, so so first of all, again, it's a privilege to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I was a federal prosecutor, and then I began teaching over now 15 or 16 years ago And in fact, when I came to Brooklyn, I started teaching, I practiced federal criminal law, but when I started teaching, when I taught the standard criminal law course, that was state law. So some of these insights I take are from that experience of going from being a federal prosecutor to learning a lot about state criminal law. And, when you talk about criminal law and putting aside for a minute white collar crime, when we talk about just criminal law in general, this is all over the world. You see strong critiques that say that criminal law, that we've over criminalized our country, right? That there are too many laws, that we criminalize too many things, and that we're too harsh in our punishments, right? And in some ways, white collar crime is similar to the rest. I often say the rest of criminal law, in that you will also see an over criminalization critique, and you can easily find examples of people, and I'm sure some of you feel this way yourselves, where either, and again, I focus mostly on federal criminal law, but you could extrapolate this to other jurisdictions. You could say, look, the federal criminal code, right? There are so many laws, so many statutes. We make a federal criminal case out of everything. And then you can also find instances of what look like over punishment. So you certainly see that argument running through white collar crime, that in the same way you see it elsewhere. But what's interesting about white collar crime is you see another argument, right? And that other argument tends to be, well, white collar crime is under enforced. And that pretty much, the place where we see that the most is whenever you hear people talking about the 2008 financial crisis. People will say again and again, why were the top CEOs not prosecuted? You can see that in other instances, when someone is not prosecuted or not prosecuted quickly, it is not uncommon for certain critics to get either on the television or write books and say, we are under enforcing the criminal law as it relates to, wealthy and elites. And so the popular narrative that is formed that sort of makes sense of this will be something like, well, we're over criminalizing when it comes to the less powerful, but we under enforce when it comes to the more powerful, right? And it's this sort of whipsaw. And I'm sort of here to tell you, I actually want to tell you a different story. So the aim of the book is to try to say, look, that's not necessarily, it's not that someone's sitting there, like there's someone behind a screen saying, haha, I'm going to over criminalize for this group over here and under enforce for that group over here. That would assume that that criminal law is coherent. I actually think something else is going on, which is that white collar crimes institutions are just completely confused and have misled us. And that as a result, we lack a clear understanding of what our institutions are actually doing. And then, of course, we lose faith in them as a result. And so, and when I say we, obviously there are a lot of the folks here have been affected by white collar crimes institutions, but even those of us who think, and we all are, we can at the same time, one can be both a target of the system, but one can also be a victim in various instances. So there are multiple instances where we feel like these institutions, we don't really know what they're doing. So the book breaks down into these three pathologies, right? To make sense of what I'm trying to argue, I say, hey, there are these three categories of pathologies in white collar crime that I'm going to tell you about. And one of those categories is in lawmaking, meaning we've got some real weirdness in how we make laws, especially federal criminal law, right? And there are a lot of problems with it as it relates to white collar crime. Then we've got this second set of pathologies that I say are pathologies of enforcement, right? And then I'm going to tell you that there's also this third pathology that I think has developed over time, which is, of course, really goes to the book itself, which is pathologies of discourse. I think people have become so used to these pat narratives that we have these sort of sticky myths, and it's hard to dislodge those myths, right? So that's part of what the aim of this book is to do, is to say, hey, I want to bring some light to this situation. All right, so when I talk about pathologies of lawmaking, my favorite metaphor that I talk about in the book is the lowly umbrella. And here's why. So imagine if visually, the way I tend to visualize things, I like to draw things on the blackboard when I teach. So when I think about state statutes and state codes in particular, particularly when I, like, for example, teach homicide, the word that comes to mind are steps. Like, I actually imagine a set of steps. And, at the bottom step might be something like 5th degree negligent homicide, or something really, in other words, something that is what I would call a lower level felony. And then you can imagine something more serious might be involuntary manslaughter. And going up from there, there's voluntary manslaughter. And then at the top somewhere would be, at the top of this step, might be first degree murder, right? And we're all used to hearing those words, first degree, second degree, third degree. And it's part of the culture, right? If you watch, television and movies and things like that. And because it's embedded in the culture, when you hear someone's been convicted of a first degree crime, it has some meaning, right? And these are these statutory steps. And also what they're doing, those statutory steps, is they're also correlated with certain limitations on punishment, meaning a low level of felony or a misdemeanor carries obviously much less punishment, right? Maximum punishment than a much higher level felony, right? So that's the world of steps. Now you come over to the world of federal criminal law, and we're in the world of umbrellas. And what do I mean by that? I mean, if you think about, for example, the mail fraud statute or the wire fraud statute, right? It covers everything from the most minor of frauds to the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme, right? And it doesn't have those statutory gradations. Now, that's not to say that everyone is being punished with the same punishment that Bernie Madoff received, right? Federal criminal law has sentencing guidelines, and I'm sure you heard. I think Doug Berman came to talk to you about sentencing, right? Sentencing guidelines do all of the sorting and dicing towards the end of a process, right? The criminal justice system's process. State statutes are interesting because they do at least some of the initial sorting at the beginning. And you might say, look, for my situation, what does it matter? It really doesn't matter what the actual punishment is. And I'm arguing it does matter because those statutes convey information. And one of the problems with federal criminal law is it's not just one big umbrella statute. Just to go back to the picture I have here, it's like we have multiple overlapping federal criminal statutes. So it's the mail fraud statute and the wire fraud statute and the healthcare fraud statute. And maybe there's a conspiracy statute you've also been charged with. And so you have all these statutes. Now, that in itself goes to issues that I'm sure you've heard of before, where you feel like have all these counts stacked against you, and that can create tremendous amount of leverage for the prosecutor. But even putting that aside, it's also creating this umbrella effect, which exactly is why I like this photo, which is we as a society, if we want to know what the government is doing and how it's making decisions, it kind of looks like this. It's as if you see one of those resorts with all those umbrellas, you can't see underneath. And if you can't see underneath, that means we as a society can't see what our prosecutors are doing. If we can't see what our prosecutors are doing, then we can't, exercise our power, our democratic power, and we can't understand what's going on. So that's one of the major arguments I make about the pathologies of lawmaking, that this umbrella system isn't conveying information. And because that's why I think one of the things our if we're going to have a criminal justice system, and I absolutely believe we should, then it has to convey information. And if it's not conveying information, or even worse, it's conveying false information or misleading information, that's something we should care about and want to fix. And that's one of my arguments, is we have this problem of these flat, meaning ungraded laws that are overlapping. On top of that, they're not well written. And so they're what I call underwritten, right? And it's sort of a play off of underwriting. And so as a result, our legislature, meaning Congress, expects someone else, namely prosecutors or judges, or sometimes regulatory agencies like the SEC, when you're talking about insider trading, to do the defining for us. That's bad too, right? Because that raises all sorts of uncertainty and problems also if you care about who's actually defining law. So that's the first part of my argument, that we have this flat, and in fact, these two are sort of work together. There are lots of scholars out there who complain about the fact that our federal criminal laws are sort of end up being, quote unquote, written by someone else, meaning judges end up essentially filling in the major gaps, or prosecutors. My point is, you kind of end up with this outsourcing problem because we rely on these flat laws. That in fact, if Congress were forced to try to engage in gradation, try to figure out what are the reasons why you might call something a low-level fraud as opposed to a more serious fraud. And by the way, I don't think it's just all about money. I think it matters what the actual person was thinking, what the other circumstances are. Maybe if Congress had to do that and didn't just punt it all up to the Sentencing Commission, that might actually lead to more efforts to actually define language and not outsource everything to, for example, agencies or prosecutors or judges. So that's sort of one section. That's the first third of the book. The middle part of the book shifts and starts talking about what I call pathologies of enforcement. And by that, I mean, we have this problem, right? That goes right with the, if you look at the years that followed the financial crisis, eventually the banks did have to pay, huge fines, and there were deferred prosecution agreements and all sorts of stuff like that. But we didn't have, this parade of people criminally convicted by the federal government, as had happened under, for example, during Enron. And although there were some prosecutions and they didn't go well, but the bottom line is there was a ton of criticism of the government. And this sort of came in two flavors. One version of critiques were essentially said, hey, federal government, you're just not creative enough, right? You should have come up with laws that, or you prosecutors should have come up with theories under these umbrella statutes that would have nabbed the people we want to nab. And that raises all sorts of issues, right? Because we're not supposed to just creatively come up with criminal theories after the fact that stretch laws. I mean, if we believe that we believe in a society what's called the legality principle, which is, the notion that criminal laws should be prescribed beforehand and put in writing. But anyway, there was one group that said you're not creative enough. There was another group that made more of a, you just didn't work hard enough. You should have worked harder. There were crimes out there you could have found if you just worked a little bit harder. So that got me into thinking about, how is it that we say, on one hand, it's pretty easy, and it's true, we do have these really broad laws, and it seems pretty easy, at least theoretically, to get in trouble. On the other hand, yet the federal government was saying all during that time period, no, sorry, we just don't have enough evidence. So the chapter 5 of the book says, hey, one way to think of this is that we don't have just one, often someone will say, is there enough evidence, right? And you'll see this on TV. Is there enough evidence to convict? And then there's a yes or no. And that's been happening a lot. You can see this going on with any number of politicians and whatnot. I actually think there are two thresholds that we want to think about, not just one. So one threshold I talk about is the liability threshold, meaning if all facts were known to everybody, right? If we were omniscient, we could see everything, is there a lot of, how high is the liability threshold? And there, I think actually, and this is somewhat scary, it's not very high. In other words, it's easier than many of us think to, if all facts were known, to commit a crime as defined by the federal criminal code, because there are so many ways, right, that we can end up under one of those umbrellas because they're so broad, whether we're talking about obstruction of justice or false statements or conspiracy, or we're talking about mail fraud or wire fraud. There are just so many ways in which we could theoretically, especially the conspiracy rules, that we could find ourselves past this threshold. On the other hand, and I think this is in some ways a good thing, not everyone who is technically liable for a crime is actually going to be criminally prosecuted. Now, there are different reasons for that. To some degree, it may be that the federal government has decided, we're not going to prosecute every single crime. We're not going to necessarily prosecute a $10,000. Maybe the federal government in some areas, I have heard federal prosecutors, at least of some jurisdictions, say, oh, I would never bother with a $10,000 federal crime. They just don't, that's not enough money. Others would absolutely say, no, that's wrong. But there are some types of crimes that some prosecutors would say, nah, I'm not going to bother. But others, it's more of a case of they feel that they haven't hit the threshold of viability. And by that there's enough there that makes them think they're going to win their case. And I think that's what was going on. And that means that they have in their mind, what are the various things I need in order to, feel viable and feel like I feel like I have a viable case that I can win. Now, the problem with that idea is the liability line is stable. It's defined by law, right? You could open up the books and figure out what it means. And it's set by legislatures and judges. Now, obviously, I already just complained to you all about the law, but still bear with me. The viability line is actually kind of a line that none of us know for sure where it is. It's dynamic. It's in the prosecutor's head. It's very likely defined, it's very likely influenced by whatever has come before, meaning, oh, that case I did before, that worked for me. I'm going to look for a lot of evidence that, this person benefited or something like that. You know, I'm going to look for fake bank accounts, something like that. That's an example of it's probabilistic in that you're making, you're sort of, all of us are trying to figure out what a prosecutor is going to do based on what they've done in the past. It's subjective and it's variable and it's all in the prosecutor's hands. That's why the viability line, I think, concerns us. Right now, what most of the time, I think what the government does is it has this gap between liability and viability, and it's finding some way to mind the gap by pushing a few cases over the viability line, right? There are other things it could do instead. It could make that viability line more clear. It could also try to narrow this gap. Maybe it shouldn't, but these are things it could do. And because it doesn't do that, and because I don't think the government itself understands the difference between these two lines, I think we end up talking past each other. And so that then leads me to a different type of problem. And as already been telling you about the pathologies of lawmaking, pathologies of enforcement, is that we end up in this world where insiders, meaning people who work within the system, people who know the prosecutors well, white-collar criminal defense attorneys, right, who often came from the prosecutor's office, they all have a pretty good sense of how things are working. In fact, that's why they command, if you're a former prosecutor in a white shoe firm, that's why you command high prices, right? Because the idea is you have an idea of how the system works. But at the same time, we have everyone else, and exceeding when you have this problem where insiders have one sense of what's going on and everyone else has a very different sense of what's going on. That's where I think you can lead to these myths, these misunderstandings, and this kind of erosion of trust in our systems, right? So that's where you'll hear things like, oh, you know, it's just elites covering for elites, for example. And I don't actually think that's what's happening, but it's not as if the government's in any good shape to explain these things because it's just too confusing, and what's going on with these institutions don't tell us enough information. Okay, so thank you so much for being with me up until this point. So if you're with me that we have some problems with these institutions that also are, I think that the answer, right, or one answer, is to fix our federal criminal code. So this is admittedly wonky, but my argument is that at least by fixing the code, it could be a first step. So what would I do? Well, first, we have these statutes that bundle multiple crimes into one statute. So those of you, if you've ever encountered the Hobbs Act pulls together multiple types of crimes, some of which imply violence, like robbery, and others of which have nothing to do with that. And yet we put them all under one statute. I would unbundle them. And the reason I would unbundle them, again, is that I think statutes ought to tell stories and narratives and give information. It doesn't help if you're bundling it all. Okay, then I would relabel some of our statutes so that the ordinary layperson understands what they're actually prosecuting. It took me a long time to realize this. It wasn't until I became a prosecutor that I learned that honest services fraud is really just bribery, right? But that's we have these weird labels where the labels don't necessarily convey what it is we're trying to actually prosecute. Why does that matter? Because it does show up a lot when we're trying to count how many crimes the federal government actually prosecuted over a given year. Okay, what about consolidating? That's where if we have 5 different flavors of fraud, but they're all doing the same thing, my argument would be to try to consolidate it all into a single fraud statute with some sort of appendix. And I think that actually would help criminal defendants, where essentially you have prosecutors coming at you with like this sort of count stacking and haha, so-and-so has, 15 counts of X or Y. Again, if you know something about the sentencing guidelines and you're an insider, you know that frankly, none of this stuff, I won't say it doesn't matter, but it doesn't matter the way someone in the press makes it sound like it matters, right? There's a very big difference there, and consolidation would help. And finally, I would argue that we need to grade our statutes, meaning there would be, in my ideal world, a lesser version, maybe 2 or 3 degrees of fraud. So there'd be a lesser version of fraud, a middle version of fraud, and a more serious version of fraud. And not necessarily based all on money, because obviously money is a reflection of harm, but it's not always a reflection of harm in the same way. And we all know this, right? There's a difference between $1 million in loss felt by one person as opposed to, $1 felt by 1 million people. And so I would want to see us try to actually come up with some way of figuring out how could we create our statutes, right? And so that's why this all goes to my view of why do we have a criminal code? Well, one idea is it's to give people advance notice of what we as a society think you should and should not do. Obviously, if we have to outsource all of the definition of our code to someone else, meaning judges or prosecutors or agencies, that's not good. The other is to restrain punishers, right? We're always concerned with the government having arbitrary power to punish us, perhaps, for example, either for marginal crimes, because of who we are, right? So we don't want to give the government that power. That's another reason why we have a criminal code. It restrains the government. But the final reason, and you can see I bolded this because I think that we don't think about this enough, is to inform the public. And I don't mean to shame people. I mean, we need to inform the public what our government is doing. How many fraud cases were there? And, by the way, I don't mean to say we don't have, there's a section of my book that talks about this, chapter 2, and we collect all sorts of information, but it's almost completely unusable, partly because our code and how it's written and these flat laws is very easy to get confused. So the aim I have is for us to kind of get together and actually solve this problem. And at the end, I talk about who should do this. And I say, look, it should be Congress. And I'm imagining they would have either some sort of standalone commission to spearhead this effort. And in the end, I say, look, whatever body Congress chooses to do this work is less important than its makeup, its transparency, and its responsiveness to the general public. The group that eventually advises Congress in the vision of its white-collar crime should reflect the views of insiders and outsiders, of the general public, and of the various stakeholders affected by government enforcement. And by that, I do mean criminal defendants. It should hear the viewpoints of regulators, investigators, judges, and the Sentencing Commission staff, but it also should listen to prosecutors and investigators who are indeed on-the-ground experts in this area, but it should not favor prosecutors to the detriment of everyone else. It should be responsive, deliberative, informed, and principled, and it should act with the goal not simply of formulating a coherent or just set of laws, but one that will also facilitate the collection and dissemination of relevant enforcement information. It should be cognizant of white-collar crime's numerous pathologies and create a code that can partially mitigate these pathologies. Mitigation may sound modest to some, but for a public that has grown so disenchanted with its enforcement institutions, it represents an important first step. So that's what this book is trying to do, is to point out all these different ways in which I think our federal code creates lots of problems and leads us to a lot of confusion and leads us to adopt all of these sort of pat narratives that aren't necessarily correct, and to maybe make things a little better, understand. And with the idea, I want this to be a large conversation that pulls everyone in, that gives everyone a voice, and that may not result in a immediately better world, but at least a somewhat slightly better one. Thank you so much.
Miriam, thank you so much for your talk and for describing the book. I'm sure we've got a lot of questions and we have people sharing. So if anyone would like to either ask a question or share your experience with anything that Miriam talked or whatever else that you'd like her to respond to, please put your name in chat and I will call on you. Please don't raise your hand. Please put your name in chat and I will call on you. But I'm going to kick us off with a question or two first, Miriam. The first is, I know you've been presenting your book. You've had a few talks. Have you presented it to decision makers? Have you presented it to people who might actually be able to institute some of this change? And if so, what has their reaction been?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, so at my own law school, we had a book talk, and it was with, sort of several scholars, sort of big name scholars, Sam Buell, who's written in this area a lot, and was a former Enron prosecutor, Dan Richman, some of you may have heard of and know. He's a Columbia law professor. He's actually has a lot of experience. He was a federal prosecutor. And then Andrew Weissman, who some of you may know was on the Mueller prosecution. So I feel like and there were some folks in the audience that I think one could argue have some relationship, not like anyone from DOJ. And I think what various people, and I will tell you, even other prosecutors who I think are the type to, have sort of who sort of go in and out of the government, usually what I get the reaction is something like, oh, they're never ever going, Congress is, and I think actually Dan said this, so I think he's channeling what others would say is like, what are you talking about? Congress can't even, get together on basic laws. What makes you think they would ever rewrite the federal criminal code? So this is implausible. It's never going to happen, pie in the sky, but thanks so much for trying. And, my response to that is, first of all, until you try, you don't get anywhere. So you should still try. And what I did say, though, at this book talk was I said, I'm in this for the long term, right? Like, I'm not expecting anything to happen tomorrow. But I do feel like the more audiences hear about this book and maybe consult it or look at it or talk to each other, right? If all of you were to talk to another 5 people, right? Then at some point, I'm hoping that eventually we get to a point where someone does say, hey, why not think about that? Why not do that? Look, and I did point this out, there was a time when a bunch of people got together in it started in the 1930s and it went all the way to the 50s and 60s. And they rewrote, that's the American Law Institute, they wrote the model penal code. And there was a time when there was no model penal code. And they got together and they wrote it. Now you can say that was bad, that was good, but they did it. And they were sincere in their effort to do that. And I do believe that people who believe that we should try to change the system, we have an obligation, even if our ideas or someone else tells us our ideas are plausible or implausible. My answer is, well, it's in the book, and talk to me in 20 years.
Thank you, Miriam. Okay, we're going to go to questions or sharing in the chat. Up first is Keith, then Bill.
Miriam, hi. Thank you so much. This was very enlightening. And, you talk about change, and change only happens when people step to the plate and swing the bat. So I applaud you for not feeling or responding to the negativity that always comes. So you've spoken to an audience that has obviously been harmed, much of it by our own doing. But as you said, there's different flavors of all of this, and grouping everybody under the same umbrella when it comes to sentencing, and we're subject to different judges. So I mean, I'm making comments, but I have specific questions, and what it relates to when I think about change, what you're talking about is very long term. So it's like when you walk into a smorgasbord, you can't eat everything. So like, what do you start with? So I'm going to give you just a couple of things that you can answer, think about, or whatever. But if we've completed our sentence is really never done. We're subject to the world at large always seeing our name in a negative light. We have no way to solve that. We try with, many of us try with SEO tools and things like that, but we want to move on with our lives. We've paid our price. We've done our time. Where does that fit into your world in terms of, changing the system? Because we have to live with this scarlet letter forever, and it's not, that to me is just unacceptable.
And I agree, and I'll admit the book doesn't go there, right? And the book basically says, hey, we're not getting the right information, but you're pointing out an incredibly important piece of it, which is you're saddled with this stain that, kind of follows you around. And that has to do with all these other systems we have. But yeah, it's part of the system we have. I could tell you, gee, if we did all these things of unbundling and grading, would it help? It might. There are definitely some people I think it would be helped by. I don't think it's useful to have these big umbrella laws, because I think what happens is if you're saying something like, it depends, if someone like, I was federally criminally prosecuted, it was a white collar crime. Again, this has to go with psychology. I think people, what's your natural thing to do when someone hears that? They go to the worst version, right? And that's what they have in their head. And again, our system encourages that. So you think immediately about the worst version. And of course, someone therefore isn't allowing you to move on, and that's not good. I wish I could tell you that my system is going to definitely improve reentry and moving on with your life. I'd like to think that, and I think that should play an important role. And I think that's an important thing to think about going forward, is how does the system like this, in other words, you want whatever new code you get to actually help with that. But I will be honest, I don't think I can't promise you it would do that, because I think our society has a way of not forgiving people, and we should. Or not even forgiving you, just simply moving on. We don't. And I think that's a different pathology. And it's admittedly, but would my little change to the code help a little? I think it would help a little.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that. And just one last question. We almost everyone that I've known, even in this group, we all took pleas. You know, we pled out because in many cases we had no choice. Cost, and then what they call the trial penalty, which is real. We know people who have experienced this in our group. Okay, and this goes down to language. You know, I'm considered a convicted felon when in fact I'm a pled felon. You know, they don't distinguish between the two, and that to me psychologically that makes a big difference when you're talking how we're presented. We took a plea. Nobody knows that when they read I was sentenced. You know, it's just, again, I'm expressing frustrations, and I'm sure many of the people in the group, and I don't want to take up any more time because a lot of people want, but if you could just give me some sense of how that fits into your situation as well.
Yeah, no, I did have, so one theory would be this. All right, you're under this big umbrella, and also you've got multiple counts in this indictment. I mean, I'm thinking of even Hunter Biden, right? Like if you hear on TV, like he's facing 17 years, which is all of the tax counts, right? And I think that if you could at least eliminate some of this count stacking, where you've got essentially the same crime, the same event is just being pled. I mean, it's just being charged in like 5 different counts, right? And then you've got this additional issue, which is there's no any kind of gradation at the beginning. If you had gradation, if the prosecutor had to, like, for example, and I talk about this in it's also in an article I wrote, but that it shows up in the book. So if I have that step system, right? Like think about the difference between negligent homicide and murder. Okay, negligent homicide, if you're charged with negligent homicide, the government doesn't have to prove as much, but there's a ceiling on how much time you spend in jail. It's what, and I call it a ceiling right, right? You've got, in other words, your proof rights aren't so strong, but your ceiling rights are a lot stronger, which means you have a lot more incentive to take the case to trial if you think you have a real shot. On the other hand, if you were charged with first-degree murder, well, you know, there's no ceiling on how much time you can get, right? Maybe you could go to jail for life, but, right, there's proof rights, meaning someone would have to show a, you know, more significant, what we would call mental state, right? And so it kind of, it's a reciprocal effect, right? For graded systems, the most severe crime, which carries a really high penalty, at least theoretically, requires more proof or more sophisticated proof from the government. Okay, that's at least theoretically how a state system that's graded is supposed to work. The federal system doesn't look anything like that. It's just, hey, we're all under the same mail fraud statute, right? We're all under the same wire fraud statute. We're all charged with conspiracy. Conspiracy is another law where, like, you know, everybody can be under the conspiracy statute, regardless of how small, you know, how relatively little you did for the conspiracy. Those are completely ungraded. There is a theory that if you graded them and you got rid of some of this count stacking, a smaller, now granted, it's going to depend on whether you have access to funds and access to good lawyers, and whether you have, that there are lots of reasons why you might still plead guilty. But if 10 or 15% of the current group out there said, you know what, I'm going to take my chances and go to trial, that would be valuable, because it would push the government to its burden of proving we want to do that. We want the government to have to prove what happened. So that is one theory, is that gradation would give at least some, and getting rid of this count stacking stuff would get rid of at least some of the leverage that the government currently has, that many people think is sort of an illegitimate form of pressure. But thank you.
Thank you.
I hope that gives some thought.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Keith. Next is Bill, then Scott.
Professor, thank you so much. I really thought was interesting what you said, the stair step example, the gradation. But one of the things that, just anecdotal from just things that I read and in things I read in the news, is there my feeling or my notion is that certain financial crimes, when they are prosecuted at the state level, the outcomes seem to be much more harsh. I don't know, that could be my perception. I'm just wondering, in your research, if you saw any kind of equivalence, whether the outcomes, whether they're pled or not, whether they are more harsh on the state prosecuted side versus the federal side.
Yeah, I'm trying to think who I would know who collects that kind of, it's really hard to collect that information, because you've got different statutes. And as you say, also, if you've got a lot of folks pleading out, it's hard to actually compare. The one thing that does come to mind, interestingly enough, is the situation with, the opioids and Purdue Pharma. That was an example of, the federal government basically, and again, was very much criticized for this, let the Purdue, they negotiate with the Purdue Pharma executives, and basically they pled out to something very minor, much to a lot of criticism from lots of folks. And now the AG's offices have gone way harsher. I mean, and also they cut a deal with Purdue Pharma that many people thought was essentially a sweetheart deal. And you can see, especially like the Massachusetts AG, the AG's offices, the state attorney general's offices have been way harsher. Now, not necessarily criminal law. They're actually using, some of those are civil enforcement. From there, you could argue that state AG, I mean, this is sort of a question, are state attorney generals, in some of these type of really big cases, they care about their populace and they're elected and therefore they care more. I don't know, are willing to take more risks. But that's the one thing that comes to mind. But it's very hard to collect this kind of information and actually reliably compare it, because it is under so many different statutes and under different, terms. It's very hard to, you don't know if you're comparing apples to apples.
Right. Yeah. Again, it was, and you're exactly right. That was my perception, but you're right. It's really hard to compare. But I do appreciate that early on you pointed out the deleterious effects of, just in, whatever case it might be. They face 40 years in prison. And when they comes out and they get 22 months, everybody's like, oh, what a sweetheart deal. When in fact, that's the way the system is structured, and they always go to the worst case. And it's not likely that somebody's going to get that. And you're right, it really has a terrible effect for those people that, both from society, because they think some people are being treated, more beneficially than others, and for the individuals themselves. So I really appreciate that is a focus in your book.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. Next is Scott, then Gabriel.
Professor, I was quite touched on many of the points you make, and I wanted to relay a comment that was made to me by one of my attorneys. I had numerous attorneys, and white collar conspiracy, wire fraud, just to put things in context. Government seems to have its own way of doing mathematics too. And that's something that adversely affects federal cases and those of us that are impacted. 1 and 1 doesn't equal 2 in the federal government, and there's nothing you can do about correcting them. That's not true, but my point is maybe overgeneralized. The government has a bad habit of using math that's just quasi-math. As a result, like in my case, they claim $50 million in victims.
Mhm.
Okay, not true, but you can't argue the fact, nor do they have to prove the fact. They can make up a number. When one of my conspirators went to trial, not trial, but to sentencing, he got a year and a day. The judge wanted to know where the victim statements were. And of course, the prosecutor had none. They hadn't done any work. Okay. So 30 days later, they go out to 2,200 or 20,000 people come back with 2,000 victims. Okay. And $8 million worth of damages, of which half was wrong. I went and did the audit. So my point is the government, that's a whole section of the law that has a bad habit of stacking white collar crime because they don't have to prove their numbers. They can make up any number they want. So I make that comment. The other thing that was made clear to me way back when was if my case had actually been a state case, I actually could have defended myself. There would have been defense mechanisms at my disposal that aren't attributed to the federal law. Now, I'm not a lawyer, as I probably don't sound like one. But had my case been a state case, I actually had defensible defense maneuvers that could have been done that might have mitigated my sentence. So I think there needs to be an alignment on that party. And then my last thought goes like this. The crimes that many of us in this group have experienced are maybe not even crimes. I'm not even sure. All right. Yes, I did a crime. Okay. But I had to plead to it in order to get to what I got to. But the federal government creates crimes. They literally create traps for the average American to fall into. And I'll cite one. In fact, I was talking to one of the group members, the PPP loans. There's a trap on every line item on an application on that PPP loan. And there are 10,000 people waiting to be sentenced to go into federal prison. 10,000 people. That's what, 10% of the existing population, or 7% of the existing population. And guess what? That's going to be minimal compared to what's the new one, the ERC, the employment rebate credit or whatever. That is fraught with, it's not that people didn't file for it. It's not that they meant to commit a crime, but the whole application process and the award of those monies, federal monies, was just fraught with a problem to begin with. And if we think 10,000 people getting ready to be sentenced for PPP loans, you can just about triple it in the next year, 2 or 3, as it relates to the employment rebate, refund credit, something of that nature. So I think the federal government, in terms of, I love your stair-step concept, because as it is in the state levels, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 in a state felony, but you don't have that in the federal environment. As a result, one of my co-defendants, and this is another brilliant terminology, misimprisonment charge. What? Come on. Who teaches that? Professors out of law school? I mean, really, who comes up with a term like misimprisonment? What was it in my case, in my code? It's pillow talk. The wife slept with her husband and the husband was my co-defendant. She should have known better. Misimprisonment. Cut me a break. Anyway, enough said on that. I still go back to the fact that with the federal laws as they are, there is no defense. You have no defense. And if you do defend, you're penalized to try and defend yourself. State law, you actually have some premise to defend yourself with certain crimes, especially white collarish crimes. But in the federal case, you're crazy if you don't plead. Enough said.
So I have two thoughts in response to what you're saying. You know, when you say the government can just come up with a number, I mean, obviously you can challenge them at sentencing. And sometimes judges do, by the way, say, no, that number's wrong.
That's kind of late.
Well, that's what I was about to say. But that's what I think the issue is, right? To you, it's like, wait, and that's one of my points about building that back into the steps, is if that's why front end sorting, if you will, putting some of that stuff in the front end, the part where a grand jury would actually ask the question, wait, do you have evidence of that? And that is, again, when you say the state, that would be more valuable than waiting until the end and it's something before a judge. And as you said, by then it's too late, right? And I do think actually that's part of my point of, you know, creating these sort of steps. And it depends obviously what you put in the steps, but I think that could have some value and could be of some help. With regard to one thing though, to keep in mind, and you're absolutely right, there are various ways in which federal both procedure and substance looks different from state procedure and substance. And that thanks to, because of what we define as for jurisdiction for purposes of federal criminal law, there's a ton of overlap, right? In other words, there's a huge amount of stuff out there that could be charged at the state level or could be charged at the federal level. Now, one of the problems is when the federal level starts to demonstrate like broader statutes, easier substantive law, you know, not as many, you know, it's not as hard as you said. And also when you have a situation where maybe federal procedure even in some ways is easier or less pro-defendant, there's going to be a tendency. And then on top of that, by the way, point out the fact that the federal government has more resources. So federal government is just richer, if you will, than the typical state DA. That means there's a real tendency for crimes to quote unquote go federal. In other words, that's part of what's happening here. When you say, gosh, if I'd been in the state, it would be different. The system is encouraging the state to punt some of this stuff to the feds, right? Because the feds can actually have an easier time doing it. And that can be a real problem if what's happening is there's less accountability. And I will say one thing you were also saying about, you know, hey, there's all this churn and there are all these sort of, you know, low level cases where people are kind of getting caught in the system. That's a real problem if what's happening is, you know, the government says, hey, we prosecuted 10,000 fraud cases this year. That gets back to my question of, well, what are those fraud cases, right? And again, if we have these umbrella statutes, it makes it harder for us to know what's happening. So everything you're saying, it actually does, you know, connect with what the book argues.
Thank you, Scott. And Miriam, just so you know, we've had a lot of conversations and speakers recently about Sixth Amendment, right to a trial, forfeiture, restitution, and one of the things that we certainly don't understand is how restitution hearings can be post-sentencing when sentencing depends upon the amount of loss, and so everybody's kind of confused as to how this all works. And we have found that many lawyers do not understand restitution and forfeiture. And if they don't understand it, then how can they be negotiating properly, even from the plea stage on? So I think you're right. More clarity from the beginning would be helpful.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Next is Gabriel, then Linda.
Yes, good evening. Good evening, Marianne, and thank you so much for your presentation. I want to circle back to the gist of your presentation where you use the word pathology. I myself, I'm a board certified holistic practitioner, and the word pathology has a meaning to me of disease or the origin of disease, which can even be life-threatening in many cases. So the pathology here, which is obviously life-threatening to those of us who are traversing this justice system, a lot of it goes back to Title 18 of the US Code, USC. That's where the pathology stems from. So here's my question. How can we effect change? And before you answer that, I'm old enough to remember when we could just write a letter or make a phone call to our congressman and things would get done. You know, you can maybe get the ball started, ball rolling. Nowadays, if you're not part of a major K Street lobbying group, if you're not writing big checks to that congressman, he's not even going to take your call. So for those of us that are going through this and that do need to address the pathology, the disease of Title 18 USC, the code system, how would you recommend we can get Congress? Because if I'm not mistaken, Congress is who, they're the legislative body, and they are the ones who pretty much author these codes. So how can we get them to cure this problem?
Yeah, you're right. Congress made the problem, so Congress has to fix the problem. One place that I haven't myself pushed myself to speak to, but I could imagine doing something, would be the ABA, which might be, and you know, I don't know, I could see some folks on the ABA who, you know, various committees who might be interested in this topic and care about it. I do think this is an area also where criminal defense attorneys could take this up. If they cared about the, you know, that they care about this. I know they're on various committees and they care about it. I have also, you know, I think this is where, you know, learned societies like the American Law Institute, if you can get more people interested in this topic, you can get them to care more. I will admit too, there are sometimes in the wake of a particularly sad or horrible situation, sometimes you can get people's attention more often. You know, I start the book by talking about Aaron Swartz, who was a computer programmer, who was looking at a very high sentence when he was, you know, again, if you went by maximum statutory punishment, and that was a horrible outcome. I think that those are cases where maybe afterwards, in the wake of something like that, you try to get people to listen to you and not simply just be about, that, you also talk to folks in the press. But I do think that the ABA might be one place to start. The American Bar, which, by the way, I'm sorry, the American Bar Association is what I'm talking about.
Thank you. Thank you,
Right.
Gabriel.
Thank you.
Elizabeth, you want to weigh in on how some of these issues go up the chain to policy making at the ABA?
Well, I was just in the midst of writing something to Miriam in the chat saying, let's talk about the ABA, because I'm currently the vice chair of the criminal justice section, and I could point you to some various avenues where your message really might resonate. Jeff, what was the second part of your question?
That can you give us a little overview of how real world issues get introduced, say by committee, and then into the criminal justice section, and then go all the way up to actual policy making or at the ABA policy level?
Well, typically the criminal justice section authors resolutions, which is a combination of a general statement of how we want the laws changed or public policy changed, and then background is included. And it's a fairly rigorous process of vetting by various committee members and also various task forces and sections of the ABA sign on to a resolution for full support before being presented to the House of Delegates. And if a resolution in support of change is passed, then that resolution can take on a life of its own. It can be cited in the media. It can be used to promote change with legislators, namely members of Congress. It can be cited by attorneys before a court. So it potentially could be something very, very powerful. But I applaud you for starting the dialogue and not paying attention to naysayers who say that, you know, this is pie in the sky. This is impossible. This is how social change is made. And I, for one, stand happy to help you in any way possible. One of the things that I would love to see addressed when we change white collar policy in this country is something I think, was it Scott who alluded to, in terms of quasi math and how we calculate or don't calculate loss, and then in turn how penalties are measured according to that so-called amount of loss.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and I would love to talk to you offline to get more thoughts. And, you know, I do obviously have some folks, you know, professor folks who sort of straddle both this sort of policy-making line. And, you know, one person who comes to mind who's been a particular friend to mine is Ellen Podcore, which I don't know if any of
Yes.
you know. Yeah,
Yes.
I mean, she's on a lot of these committees. She played a big role in my career. I would definitely talk to her. But my aim right now, and, you know, the book is only 6 months old, or not even, I mean, it got published in August, is really right now to get to as many groups as possible. But I think, you know, the more I can get it before people, I think the more we can get a conversation going. And I do think there is this tendency towards shoddy math, but I think that's because the guidelines encourage that. And this weird system of having it all done at the end, there's no incentive to, you can't challenge it at the beginning. It's not going before, you know, again, as you say, you don't have to prove anything. That's a problem.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We're going to go to Linda, then Tom, then Laura.
Hi. I actually want to talk to you as an educator. 30 years ago, I graduated from the Temple Knight program. I'm not a practicing attorney anymore, but anyway, and it had nothing to do with this. Mine was an IRS issue that went south. Many of the principles that we learned in school, and maybe it's because I'm a little dated, okay, maybe a lot dated actually, but the idea, the principle behind criminal law was always truth beyond a reasonable doubt. Now we have prosecutors on the federal system that are winning between 97.5% and 98% of the time. Obviously, in order for that to happen, the cards are stacked. How do you reconcile that with constitutionality? You know, the three points, trial penalty. Okay, you have a constitutional right to a trial. Do you really? Not really. And I just wanted your opinion on it, really.
So I think there still are some folks out there. It depends on the type of crime. I think there are folks who still say, I'm going to take my case to trial. And in fact, if it's in the book, some folks win, right? So it's not 100%. It's not 100%. I know that doesn't make you feel better.
But it's so stacked.
I think it depends on, so what prosecutors would say in response, they'd say, no, that's not true, because you're not seeing all of the work that went into deciding which cases to take and all the work, work we do before we charge a case. Again, I can totally understand the perspective that says, wait, what are you talking about? You didn't even have to prove some of these things. I think this goes back to, again, if you have these statutes that are written a particular way where the government can kind of, charge a bunch of things and doesn't have to worry about certain issues until later. then yes, that's a real problem. And it is undermining the concept of proof beyond a reasonable doubt if it turns out, for example, you don't have to prove the loss beyond a reasonable doubt or the amount of loss. That makes a very big difference. And so I think those are issues that absolutely are true. And in fact, that was something, interestingly enough, it came up when the sentencing guidelines were first enacted. They were actually mandatory. And then eventually that made it all the way to the Supreme Court. And it was actually, interestingly enough, it was Justice Scalia who said, these are concepts that ought to have been, he talked about the Sixth Amendment. He said, this should be before a jury. You should have to prove this to a jury. Now, the way the Supreme Court, though, ended up solving the problem of the sentencing guidelines was they said, okay, well, that's fine. Instead of it being mandatory, we'll make it advisory. That was a real problem, because once they made it advisory, it's still, in the end, that's the anchor. That's what the judges go by. And now, true enough, in the white collar context, it's interesting. Over time, judges have diverged more from the white collar guidelines, but that doesn't matter. It's still the anchor. And that's still really scary. And it's something that doesn't have to, if it doesn't have to be proven, I can see how, again, to the rest of the world, it seems like there's no beyond a reasonable doubt going on here. And I think that does contribute to this. And again, and this is what something I think the federal government doesn't see. I will go to a DOJ conference, and the DOJ prosecutors will say, oh my God, we're working so hard and we try to be so transparent. And I know you're saying like,
Yeah.
And they really don't get, they really do, they mean it sincerely, right? They're like, I don't get it. How do I get people to trust me? And I think it's like not a case of, they could talk until they're blue in the face. It's actually the code. They don't realize that part of it is the system itself. Until they, weirdly enough, when I wrote this book, what I said to several people was, the group I really want to hear me, I know this sounds weird, are federal prosecutors. Because I want to say, hey, federal government, you know what? If you want your people to have faith in your system and not just turn around and say, oh, these guys are doing whatever they want, then you should want to actually have some of these changes. You should want these changes. You should adopt some of these changes because it would actually be better for you. I don't know that I'm going to convince anyone of that, but that's part of it, because I don't think it's good for our society that people walk around saying, it's all rigged. Actually, that's not good.
A lot of people in our group, the universal experience is that prosecutors, once they have that case, it's win at all costs. If they have to lie, steal, and cheat to get that conviction, that's what they will do. And that doesn't make them look like the good guys anymore, because they're not. And I mean, I'm talking, we would have a huge percentage that would look at the prosecutor and say, wow, were they interested in right and wrong, or were they interested in winning? They were absolutely interested in winning. They want that other notch on their belt.
And I guess I would say that a lot of the people I knew would say, well, I was interested in both. And I understand as a psychological that's very difficult to say that, right? They'd say, oh, no, I'm worried about both.
Yeah, I'd like to meet one.
Thank you, Linda.
Okay.
Next is Tom, then Laura.
Thank you, and thank you, Ms. Baer. I'm in a kind of an interesting situation because I was a state legislator for 10 years, and I actually was involved in writing the statute that I was convicted under, and I can say without a shadow of a doubt, as I'm sitting here, that my case was not the kind of case that was discussed in the process of that law being written up. And I can also say to Scott over here that don't be thinking that the state system is all that much better, because actually a lot of what's been put into state laws, I know, is phrases like negligently or purposely caused the harm. And that really, if you think about it, sort of negates the need for mens rea, because the prosecutor, who Linda is absolutely, and Keith talking about the trial penalty, is absolutely right about. And the thing is that sometimes when I was in the legislature, we did work very hard on the language. But you turn it over to these prosecutors and they are heat-seeking missiles. I'm sorry, that's what they are, and that's what they do. And the other thing is that now, in the present time, and I don't want to, I think what you're doing is very good, because you're absolutely right. If you don't start the discussion, it'll never happen. But I don't see how you can think that you can rewrite laws to make them better in a Congress that has Matt Gaetz, Marjorie Taylor Greene. I mean, how would you explain to a Marjorie Taylor Greene the concept that you're even talking about? And these are the people who are running the show now. And it's not just them, but then get it into the Senate. They got 3 supposedly very well-educated Harvard lawyers there, Hawley, Cotton, and the great Ted Cruz, who are working very hard to show how stupid a Harvard lawyer can actually be. And I said names, and I'm willing to say them again. And the other thing, I think, people generally say, we want the criminals to go to prison. And the politicians can just take that. Now, especially those 3 senators, especially Cotton. He's all about, you talk about shortening sentences to that guy, and he just, becomes totally blank. And there's so many of them in politics nowadays that will be that way. And I think we're having this discussion, and this is not white collar crime, but it's an absolute example of what we're talking about, in the shadow of what's going on in Texas in the last week or so, where, of course, they tried to ban abortions, but the pals all know that if it means a woman's going to die, we can't do it. We can't get the people go along with it. So they write what they say is an exception, and now it turns out that exception is not an exception at all. And that case is going to be repeated and repeated and repeated. And I really hope that it does inspire people to get more interested in who's writing these laws and what they actually say. Because, that's a very extreme case, obviously. But in every area of the law, these things like purposely or negligently, the little loopholes that get written in purposely or negligently are all sitting there, and they are, trapping people. Scott talks about the 10,000 people with the PPPs. It's all over the place.
Thank you, Tom.
I mean, one thing I was going to say, you remind me that, and this is a criticism, a friend of mine who writes about state laws says, he says you're idealizing the states a little bit too much. And that's a fair criticism. I do say in the book, look, I'm not saying all grading is perfect and all state statutes are perfect. I'm saying it's better to have some effort to actually start having this debate. And I don't doubt that we can all look at folks in Congress and point out, our least favorite congressman. But that doesn't change the fact that if we keep pushing the body to make decisions, that there could be a path to reform. And I think that also goes to, if you know that there's legislation you really want, maybe that will incentivize more people to get involved and actually elect people who will write that legislation. To me, they go hand in hand.
Well, I hope you're right. And I have to say, my congressman is a pretty smart man. And whenever I hear him talk on TV, I say, how does this man go home at night after listening to being in the same room with those people and not just drink himself to oblivion? And I'll shut up now.
Thank you, Tom. Laura.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to thank you for going through your book tonight. It's been very helpful. And I think Tom kind of started to talk about something that I was kind of curious your thoughts on. You mentioned Congress being where changes in code need to be made, but oftentimes I feel like the umbrella message that you reference in your book is what they use to help for getting reelected. When the irony is, I think if we were having the graded systems and demonstrating where proper use of the system is in place, that I think that really does help not only build trust with their constituents, but also see where the proper punishment's being placed. My question was geared around if Congress sometimes will be looking out for themselves, and if tough on crime and umbrella messaging helps them, where we touched on a little bit earlier, where can some of the advocacy begin? Are we the right people to be advocating, or who would we be working with to advocate for some of these thoughts and changes? Because I do see in many places it may be too late for some of us, but for future folks and generations, that where this change and this mindset really needs to start. And where can we make an impact when maybe some of our local politicians aren't the right place to start, but maybe work through advocacy groups?
I think that's right. I think also there are folks in Congress who I think this is a time also to glom on. I don't mean glom onto. I want to piggyback onto. There is a growing recognition that mass incarceration is not good for our society. And so if you, and there are a lot of people who say that, and a lot of people who realize that that's not good. And so I think there could be a broader coalition of folks who understand, going back to that last slide of why have a criminal code. Okay. If you are worried about your federal government having too much power, and you're worried about your politicians having too much power, then you want to have those constraints, and you want clearer laws, and you want more language, and you want to build in those grades. And there are some politicians out there who recognize that and recognize the importance of that, because maybe one day they're going to be on the target end of that stuff.
Right.
And that, but that matters, right? Like you have to, and I think there is, but even apart from that, there's the fact that it is not healthy to just churn people in and out of a system. That is we know that it causes lots of collateral damage and harm. Now, I don't agree we should just give up on the criminal justice system altogether. I think there's a real need for a criminal justice system, but I think we need a criminal justice system we all could actually believe in and feel proud of. And I think that you could find people who agree with that, and understand. One of my points is it's not about just haranguing. And again, I understand there are a lot of folks here who've had the people that you see and you have the greatest experience with are prosecutors. So I totally get why that's how you're going to see it, as it's the prosecutors. But my point is actually we're missing something. It's Congress, it's statutes. And until we do something about that, this other stuff is going to continue. And I think there are people who could join together in that effort to convince Congress of that.
Miriam, if with some of the stats that Linda shared and that we can see online as far as prosecutor success rates in the current environment, I feel like that group of people may be more reluctant to this message and reluctant to change, because right now the statistics don't warrant for them this tiered grading system. However, I feel strongly, and with many of us, that what you're trying to do and what your message is very worthwhile and needed.
Thank you. I'll keep working.
Thank you, Laura.
Well, let us know where we can help, because sometimes it's just not knowing where we can plug in appropriately.
Thank you, Laura. And Miriam, thank you. I'm just going to make one comment before we come out, that as a white collar community, the more we lift ourselves up and join together, we'll have seats at the table that previously wouldn't allow us to be there. And I know in many cases now we're on nonprofit boards, and we are being readmitted into different professions, and we've got to do the work. And if we do the work for ourselves, and then we engage with people like Miriam Baer, Elizabeth Kelly, they're gonna be able to walk into different rooms and say, I met a lot of people who have a lot to say on the subject, and I think we should welcome them into this conversation. So it's not just us being a part of their conversation. We want them as a part of our conversation, and together we grow and we have more voice. And for that reason, amongst many others, Miriam, we thank you for being with us tonight. And certainly we would welcome any opportunity to interface with Brooklyn Law School or anyone else you think is appropriate. So thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for being with us tonight.
Thank you. And these were some of the best questions I've ever received. So thank you. It was really an honor and a privilege, and especially it's in the evening. So, a good night, everyone. And thank you really so much. And Elizabeth, I will, connect to you and get some more information on that. But to all of you, thank you.
Professor, we'll put a link to your book also in our schoolroom as well. There's about 220 of us in there. So
Thank you.
we'll link that over there too.
That's great. All right. Thank
And
you.
I
everyone.
already sent you an email.
Okay. All right. Well, that's wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Professor.
Join us
Good
again
night.
on January 16th, and we will see you again soon. Thank you, Miriam.
Thanks
Thank
so much,
you.
Jeff.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.